Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is a podcast about curiosity and wide thinking. Today on the show, I am joined by the curator, Aric Chen. Earlier this summer, it was announced that Aric had been appointed the new general and artistic director of the Nieuwe Institute, which is a Rotterdam cultural institution that is this kind of really interesting mix of museum, research center, and agency. Before this, Aric was the curatorial director for Design Miami. He served as a curator at large for M+, where he helped start the new museum's collection, and was a creative director of Beijing Design Week. He also is a faculty member and is the founding director of the Curatorial Lab at the College of Design and Innovation at Tongji University in Shanghai. I've been a fan of Aric's work for a long time and was especially interested in the diversity of his work. He's moved across disciplines, he's worked inside institutions and independently, and he's worked all over the world. So we begin this conversation talking about the threads that connect this diverse body of work and how he thinks about his own practice. We talk about how his new position at the Nieuwe Institute fits this way of working and what he wants to bring to the institution. And we also talk about how the design discourse has changed over his career and where he sees it heading. I very selfishly got so much from this conversation. I found it so interesting and helpful as I kind of process my own work, and I hope that you enjoy it as much as I did. If you like the show, I hope you consider supporting it on Patreon. We offer 3 monthly tiers, $3 for students, $5 for patrons, and $10 for superfans. Every tier gives you access to all sorts of bonus content like monthly newsletters, early episodes, transcripts of every episode, and exclusive bonus interviews each month, all while helping to continually financially support the show. So if you like Scratching the Surface, if you want to see it continue, if you want more of it in the world, I hope you consider joining us on Patreon. You can visit patreon.com/surfacepodcast for all the details and to help support the show. Thank you as always for your support. And here is me with Aric Chen. I want to talk about your new position in this new job that you've just started. But before we do that, I want to try to frame that a little bit. And your career is one that I've been following for a while, and it's one I'm very interested in because you worked across kind of journalism and criticism and curatorial practice. You've worked in institutions, at museums, at design fairs. You've worked independently. You've kind of been all over the place. You're working in different geographic locations all over the world. And I'm curious if you think there's something that connects those roles and those locations, or is there a certain, kind of curatorial point of view or critical project or some thread that connects those? How do you kind of think about all of the work that you've done?
Yeah, wow. Well, I suppose it's, I mean, now that you've sort of thrown it all back at me, I guess my life has been a bit, I don't know, maybe not random, but let's say heterogeneous, I guess, within the fields of architecture and design. And I suppose if you asked me to pull out one thread that connects all of it, I guess I'd have to say curiosity, maybe. Paolo Antonelli, who you've interviewed before, her Twitter handle is Curious Octopus, and and I think that's kind of a good way to put it. And in some ways, I think many of us, or really all of us, as curators and journalists and podcasters, are largely defined by our curiosity, and that's what's really driven me to do the range of stuff, I guess, that I have.
I totally agree with that. And I feel like, when I talk about the work I've done, I feel the same way where it's like, oh, this is just all over the place. I don't know if this kind of adds up to anything. But the reason that I asked that is because you just started this new position at the Nieuwe Institute. You were just appointed the general and artistic director. And as I was thinking about this conversation, I kind of felt like this new position in a way contains everything that you've done before. I mean, the Nieuwe Institute is a museum, it's a research center, it's an agency, there's kind of different programming, and you've kind of done all of that in these kind of other different avenues around the world. Do you have thoughts? Can you talk a little bit about kind of why this position was interesting to you and how maybe you see this building upon what you've done before?
Well, I mean, it's really funny to hear you put it this way because there is something to that, I think. I've been
Mm,
living in China for the past 13 years, and to be very honest, I've been quite happy here. And I wasn't
mm,
looking to leave or move. But when this chance came up, uh, I mean, if you had if you had asked me even 6 months ago or a year ago, what institution I would really love to lead, the New Institute would have been right up there. And I think the fact that it is so open, that it is, an institution that, in its very name, the New Institute is,
hmm.
not only aspires to, but actually has a mandate to constantly try new things, was really what made this. Too good not to, too good to turn down.
Right.
Um, and and that's something that I would really love to maintain. I mean, the New Institute has been doing such incredible work over its short lifespan. I mean, it's a very young
Hmm.
institute, though it has a
Yeah.
long history, having been the result of the merger 8 years ago of three existing institutes. Um, Across architecture, design, and digital culture. That it's sort of known for I guess being a little bit all over the place, and in
Right.
speaking with some colleagues just recently, some were saying maybe we should focus a bit more, and on the one hand maybe yes, but on the other hand I was like no, let's let's not let's maintain that kind of openness and um, that almost stream of consciousness proclivity to constantly look at new things in new ways.
That kind of goes back to that first question, that I was kind of interested in because if that from the outside, and I don't, I was aware of the New Institute. It was a institution that I was kind of fascinated by, but I had never actually been there. It was all just kind of seeing it online, and it seemed like what you just said, where it's just kind of doing everything across all these different kind of mediums and forms, and in a way, that's why it seemed like you were kind of perfect for that because that's been your career.
Wow. Yeah.
Also, as the general and artistic director, can you talk a little bit about what that job entails? I imagine that that's kind of thinking about programming and kind of curatorial things, but it also sounds like, you're running the institution, you're doing kind of all the administration stuff also, kind of overseeing
Well,
that.
I am. Another thing that made this job too good to turn down was that it's actually run by two of us. So there's me, who's the general
Mm,
and artistic director, and then Yosin Paulidis, who is the managing director. And
okay.
and I think that really has been designed to kind of build on sort of mutual strengths and
Yeah. Yeah.
I find the administrative part of running an institution to be super interesting,
Hmm.
actually, and it is something that I'm already finding myself getting quite involved with at the New Institute. But it's also really good to be working as a team with someone else who's even better at it.
I've never run kind of administration at an institution, but I find it very fascinating. I especially find people who come from sort of creative or, like non-businessy backgrounds who find themselves in that position, how they kind of think about it. And I've talked to so many people, so many administrators who come from design or architecture or curation who think about that also as a type of kind of creative practice or curatorial practice. Does it feel kind of a kind of your other work?
Yeah, in a way, for sure. I mean, to the extent that curating is about, in many ways, creating scenarios. I mean, what you're doing with an
Mm,
institution is you're seeing different ways in which internally you can create scenarios that then can be sort of communicated and projected and have impact externally. So it is very sort of process driven, or it shares that kind of process driven um,
right.
uh, element with curating, with research, with all sorts of creative practices, as you say.
I have one other question about the new institute before kind of talking about your larger work. And I'm interested, you started answering this in the previous question, but I'm interested in kind of what you want to bring to this position and to the institution. And like we said, it is a museum. It does have a collection. It is a research center. It's an agency. Are there areas in there that you're excited about that you have plans to build upon, or kind of projects that you're excited to kind of get going on? I know you just started, but where do you kind of see potential new interests that you can kind of bring in there?
Yeah, well, maybe if I can just build a little bit more on your earlier question before I answer this
Mm,
one, like another thing that's been fascinating to me also is to look at how institutions work, in the
mm,
Netherlands, versus China or the U.S. or any of the other places that I've um, had some experience working in, and what's really been fascinating to me is the extent to which um, you know, the extent to which p- people in the Netherlands are really very much driven by these process based
mm.
approaches. And it's funny because I often hear people there complaining about the bureaucracy, but coming from where I come
Yeah.
from, it's really not so bad. And in fact, much of that bureaucracy is so incredibly sort of people centered. It is
Mm,
there is this incredible emphasis on building consensus, but also about giving different staff members a feeling of ownership and belonging. It's so humane, and as a like
yeah.
and as a both an American and someone who's been living in China for so long, and both of which
Yeah.
are actually very hierarchical systems. The U.S. and China have more
Right.
in common than they'd like to admit sometimes. It's been really
Interesting.
really interesting to watch how the Dutch work. Um, Now, going to your next question, I guess, which was about what I sort of hope to see with the institute. Again, to reiterate, I mean,
Yeah.
my interest in the position was because I was so. I've been such a big admirer of their work over the past
Mhm.
8 years that they've been around. Um, but what's been fascinating is because is the fact that, as I mentioned, the New Institute was the result of a merger between what was formerly the Netherlands Architecture Institute, the
Mm,
Premsla, which was the kind of an institute for design and fashion, and the virtual platform, which focused on digital culture. And that
mm,
was actually a very painful merger because it was sort of politically driven by a right wing government. But but
okay.
uh, but in a way, it's regardless of how badly how bad the circumstances may have been for this to
Yeah.
happen,
Yeah.
in a way it created a lot of opportunities, and really what the institute has been doing for the past 8 years under Hoos Boimer uh, is to really think about what the institute is and what an institute can be, right? And hence the sort of idea of
Mm,
constant perpetual newness comes into the equation.
mm-hmm,
Now I
mm-hmm,
think the institute has found its footing, and we can sort of shift emphasis a little bit from what an institute can be to
mm,
what an institute can do. And so, with all these amazing ideas floating around the institute that have been explored, whether it be they were one of the earlier the earlier institutions looking at biomaterials. They're
mm,
looking at questions about assigning rights to non-human entities and multi-species urbanism and all sorts of things. We can really begin to use the institute and what it does as a testing ground for some of
mm.
these ideas, and this is something that I think we'll be really exploring looking forward.
Let's go back in time for people who are not familiar with your work, and kind of how you got here. You originally you have a BA in architecture and a BA in anthropology from UC Berkeley. Did you? Well, let me ask you this question in two ways. With this kind of architecture and anthropology, where did your interest in design come from? And then the second part is, did you think you were going to be an architect? Like, was that the plan at the time, was to design buildings?
Yeah, well, I have to admit, my first love was probably architecture, and I grew up in Chicago,
Mm,
a few blocks from Frank
mm,
Lloyd Wright's Robie House, and as many people probably know,
mm-hmm,
architecture is very much ingrained in the culture in Chicago, and
mm-hmm,
I very much fell prey to that. Um, but in high school, I did a few internships, or I did an internship, I should say, working at an architecture firm, and I realized very quickly that I wasn't cut out to be an architect. Needless to say,
yeah,
it's what I loved and it's what I decided to study. And then while I was studying it, I realized that there was a kind of piece that was missing for me. And to be honest, it wasn't so well thought out, but I was always sort of drawn to anthropology by for
mm,
by pure
mm,
convenience. The anthropology building was right next to the architecture building, and so picked up I picked up anthropology, and then long story short, after school, I sort of putzed around for a couple of years and decided to get my MA in design history because I came across this program at the Cooper Hewitt Museum,
mm-hmm.
offered jointly with Parsons, and I really went by instinct, and it was only after the fact that I kind of realized that the my education had basically trained me to look at people, spaces, and things, right?
Mm,
Anthropology, architecture, and design history, um, and I think that's probably what's sort of driven me ever since. Not just those disciplines per se, but really the way people, spaces, and things interact, the kind of boundaries between them, the gaps between them, the ways they interact. And fortunately for me, this is this is kind of the direction that design discourse has moved
yeah.
in recent years as well. So it's worked out well.
Can you talk a little bit about that Cooper Hewitt Parsons program and what that was like? I'm not sure, but I'm pretty sure you're the first person I've had on the show who has gone through that program. What kind of classes were you taking? What was that like, and how did that end up shaping the work that you did after?
Yeah, I mean, it was really perfect for me. I came from a very big school, which is Berkeley, which had
Mm-hmm.
32,000 students at the time. And on one coast, and I was kind of ready to try something new, and New York came calling. And it was great to spend time in a museum with just 16
Mm.
people in my class. And that smallness really allowed for a lot of flexibility. And it's funny what you said earlier, going back to this being all over the place. I mean, I think what kind of drew me to the program also was I at that point, and this was in the mid to late '90s. I never even thought of design history as like a field, right? I mean, and and suddenly, to be confronted with this possibility of just kind of understanding all these things that you see both in museums and in daily
Yeah.
life,
Yeah.
to really understand that there are trajectories that these are part of, that there are histories and narratives that they are embedded in, and also that there are histories and narratives that have yet to be written about them. Being a relatively young field was just really exciting. So I love the fact that I could learn about the Italian Renaissance and Rococo at the same time as I could learn about, uh, the brown Dieter Rams alarm clock that I had next to my dorm room in college. And also the fact that we could bring into that, interiors and landscapes,
Mm-hmm.
which were also part of the curriculum,
Mm-hmm.
was just kind of not necessarily filling gaps, because I never really thought of these things as gaps, but just or new areas, that I could sort of
Yeah.
be exposed to.
I mean, I guess at this point we should just lean into the theme of the conversation being all over the place.
Why not?
Because I mean, I'm the same way, and my work's the same way, and my interests are the same way, frankly. And I think this is a very kind of personal, selfish question that I'm about to ask you, but I came from graphic design and was very focused for the first part of my career on graphic design. And as I've gotten older and as my work has changed, my kind of scope of interest has expanded, where I'm very much interested in architecture and furniture and interiors and product and institutions and the design of these institutions, and that my interests have gotten bigger and bigger and wider, and I sometimes have this sense that or maybe this fear of being too wide and not deep on anything, and that maybe I should just, tune everything else out and kind of just focus on a couple core things. Did you ever feel that pressure? Did you ever feel like, what, I should have like a focus. I should not keep just kind of, following every single thing that I'm curious about.
Yeah, I have that feeling all the time, and to put it more bluntly, I have that insecurity all the time, right? But
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, it's about kind of understanding your role, right?
Mm,
Um, I'm someone who, for example, I love archives, and I love going into archives and spending a few hours, but that's it. Like after a few hours, or a few afternoons, I'm just physically incapable of
yeah.
of sitting
Yeah.
there any longer. Um, and it's taken me a while, but I've come to accept that that's actually okay. That
Mm, mm,
we fortunately live in a world where there are a lot of smart people deep diving into a lot of different things, and in some
yeah.
ways, given that, you need others who have a kind of broader view, who can kind of connect the dots.
Mm,
And in some ways, that is not only like I learned this not only in my role as a journalist, right, where
yeah.
you're really absorbing a lot of different information from a lot of places, and maybe you can't go as deep as you want to with everything, but you need people to kind of bring the pieces together. Uh, and in many ways, that's what the role of a curator, I think, is increasingly becoming.
Mm-hmm.
There is just too much knowledge, too much expertise out there for a curator to be knowledgeable and expert about everything that a curator has to sort of tackle, certainly in a contemporary context. Um,
Right.
and in some ways, we've become more like ringmasters, right? It's about almost
Yeah. Yeah.
identifying, who's
Yeah.
who's good with the tigers and who's good with with the clown cars, and so on and so forth, and bringing them all together, and making the magic happen that way.
Right, right. Yeah, I love that, and I mean, it makes me feel better about
Good, I
myself.
hope so.
Honestly, I think that's a really good way to think about it. I like that you brought up the journalism, because I wanted to talk about that move from journalism to curation, and after you finished at the Cooper Hewitt Parsons program, was the idea that you were going to be a writer and kind of be a journalist? Was that the plan at that time?
No, I like I did after my undergrad. I just sort of spent some time putzing around
Mm,
a little bit.
okay, okay.
Long story short, and this is where I've also kind of learned to go with the flow a little bit.
Mm,
I don't mean to sound
mm-hmm,
fatalistic,
mm-hmm.
but sometimes the path of least resistance, can take you to places where you might wind up quite happy. Um, and so after grad school, I just messed around, and again, to make a very long story short, I had interned while in grad school at the Met
Mm,
in New York, and one day I got a call from a woman named Susan Lewin, who had ran a PR firm in New York, who was a friend of one of the curators at the Met, who I had met,
mm,
and she was looking for somebody. The curator mentioned me, was kind enough to mention me, and Susan called, and I said, "Sure, why
mm.
not? I'll give PR a try." 10 months later,
Okay.
I realized maybe PR wasn't the right thing for me. Um, but in the process, I was meeting all these journalists and editors, and I was like, "That's what I want to be
Mm.
doing," and and that's how it started. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that move from journalism to curation, and how? So, I mean, again, this is perhaps a selfish question. I'm someone who does a lot of writing, has found myself in somewhat of a kind of journalistic mode over the last year or two, and is very interested in curating. And I've talked to many curators over the last year about that jump from writing to curating, kind of actually working with the objects, making an argument in a physical space. What was that transition like for you? How did that kind of come about, and did that feel like a kind of logical continuation of the journalistic work you were doing?
Yeah, it happened very organically, and it's not uncommonly. I mean, if you think about it, the number of museum
Yeah.
curators and directors in our field, in design and architecture, who actually came from journalism, is really quite astounding. I mean,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
I'd say more than half of us. But and there's a good reason for that, and I think it fundamentally comes down to the fact that curating and journalism are actually not that different fundamentally, in the sense that
Hmm.
for both, what you do is you go out and see as much as you can and learn about as much as you can. You do some filtering, some
Yeah.
editing, you make some judgments, you do some due diligence, and then you kind of find a story, and your job is to kind of create this story or narrative for a broader audience, and I think that's why so many of us wind up getting asked to start curating little projects at first, which is what happened to me, and then in my case, the balance just sort of shifted, where the
Right.
writing was my work, and the curating was a hobby, and now it's the curating became the work, and the writing became more of a hobby.
I don't want to go through kind of every job
Yeah,
that
please
you've
don't.
had, but I do want to spend a little time talking about your time at M Plus and kind of building that collection, because I think that really connects to what we're talking about curiosity, about having that kind of wide purview about this kind of ringleader that you're talking about. Because one of the thing, and you've talked about this a lot, so we don't have to talk about it too much, but
Yeah.
one of the things that you were working on when you were at M Plus was actually building that collection from scratch. And that to me seems different. Correct me if I'm wrong, but that seems different than just kind of curating an exhibition. That's thinking about something with a much kind of longer view. And I'm curious how you thought about that, kind of thinking about how am I going to select these things that are then going to kind of be here, that this is the collection. Did that change your approach at all working on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, this comes back to being all over the place again, because
Yeah. Yeah.
in some ways, building that collection was a form of embracing being all over the place, and
Mm-hmm.
very purposefully so. And I'll explain that in a minute. But I should start by saying that the museum, wasn't totally coming from scratch, in the sense that it had a clear mission, which was 20th and 21st century visual culture, which was kind of an umbrella term at the time, for visual art, design and architecture, which was the area that I looked after mostly, and visual and moving image. Excuse me. And it
Mm.
was, like I said, 20th century till now, and it was meant to have a global
Right.
scope, but as seen from our vantage point in Hong Kong, China, East Asia,
Right.
etc. The same way, and it was really being positioned, and still is being positioned, as kind of to um, uh, to give you the elevator pitch, sort of Asia's answer to MoMA and the Pompidou,
Right. Right.
and Tate,
Right.
if Tate had design and architecture and so on. Uh, and that was very also really about kind of reflecting an increasingly multipolar world, which is something that we are seeing
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
which we're seeing play out more and more. But the idea was to create to contribute to a global conversation with another perspective. That perspective being very kind of very much rooted in our region. Now, that being said, with the
Yeah.
collection, people always ask, "How do you start?" Right?
Mm-hmm.
And my answer is always, it's easy. You just start, um, and you just start knowing that a collection has no end. It only has a beginning,
Right.
meaning that what you're doing, and we were very aware that we were laying the foundation. A foundation to be built on in the future. So
Mm.
when it came to design and architecture, we just really cast a wide net and started identifying kind of starting points, whether it's you know uh, mid-century mid-century plywood furniture, mid 20th century
Right.
plywood furniture in Japan, or tropical modernism in South and Southeast Asia, or even sort of we were watching mainland China just across the border sort of transform right before our eyes, and so we were looking at for everything from the kind of emergence of the first and second generation contemporary Chinese architects. One has to remember that private architectural practices in since Mao had not been even allowed in China until the 1990s. So
Right.
we were watching the development of a whole new set of of architectural languages, to things like copying and piracy. Shenzhen, which was long known as the capital of piracy, though now it's sort of known as the capital of tech. And was right across the border, and so we would troll the aisles of the electronics market to kind of build a collection that looked at how, in fact, copying and counterfeiting as a stage of development that's been repeated all over the world as countries have industrialized, how that is actually a generative process that leads to innovations, and we've seen that happen in Shenzhen in just a few years that we um,
Yeah.
have been doing this. So part of it also for me was like a little bit wanting to make sure that some of the constraints that some of our colleagues at other older, more established institutions have. You'll hear stories from curators at other museums being told they can't acquire certain things because that museum has never acquired it before. That type of
Mm,
material. Like one
right.
colleague said that he
Right.
wanted to acquire a bicycle, and he was told, no, we don't have bicycles in our collection. Another colleague wanted to acquire like a speculative design that was um, that they didn't know how to categorize except as jewelry, but they don't collect jewelry, so she couldn't acquire it, even
Mm-hmm.
though this design really had nothing to do with jewelry per se. So I made sure we had some jewelry. I I made sure we had some bicycles.
I was
you
gonna,
know, and really, yeah, I was just very conscious that we were setting precedents.
I mean, this speaks to something that you said kind of earlier in your answer that I think is a really interesting distinction that I want to hear you talk more about. Talking about M Plus was not a museum of Asian visual culture, but was sort of like uh, an equivalent to MoMA or the Pompidou, in that it was kind of rooted in the region, but not about the region, I think is kind of how you said
Yeah.
it. Can you talk a little bit about how that framed these decisions about building that collection? Obviously, you can just start, but how did the region specifically maybe create that lens to then think about building the collection?
Yeah, this is a fascinating question, especially to think about now, because obviously the world has changed a lot in the, I
Hmm.
guess, 9 years since I was first hired there.
Mm.
Um, the kind of I guess political background is that for a long time Hong Kong and sort of trying to bolster its competitiveness as a financial and as a financial hub where
Mm.
quote East meets West and so on and so forth, right? The city had sort of really tried to position itself as Asia's world city, and so it was
Mm.
from that kind of, let's say, directive that a museum like M Plus was even possible. Now, over time, and M Plus has actually been in the making for much longer than
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
than curators have been there building a collection. Um, over time, the situation has gotten more complex, right? And
Mm.
in Hong Kong, tensions with mainland China began to come to a head right as we were beginning to build the collection, and so the motive for really asserting this global view rather than an identity rooted in uh, kind of more localist agendas uh, shifted to basically trying to keep the kind of outward looking spirit of Hong Kong
Mm.
from sort of
Right. Right.
contracting as it seemed to very quickly. Now, at the same time, uh, I think it was really important for us to also reflect the fact that the world was changing and it was becoming more multipolar. That there was no longer a center or and a periphery, but rather multiple centers in which
Hmm.
Ideally in the future, we're all at the center and all at the periphery at the same time, right? I
Right.
guess this
Right.
is another way of talking about what used to be referred to as glocal, that really horrible term
Right.
that let's not repeat again. So it was a way of kind of asserting these other voices from other perspectives within global conversations, that design, and in the context of design and architecture, that these histories were not were were in many cases largely written and broadcast the loudest from the West. But that doesn't mean that there weren't histories,
Hmm. Right.
in our part of
Right.
the world that could sort of stand on their own legs within transnational contexts. So it was really important for us to kind of to really emphasize that, and it was fascinating to me because at first it was difficult to explain how a global museum could be in Asia, or how a museum could be global and Asian at the same time. People are like,
Right.
either you're a museum of Asian stuff, or you're a museum of like global, i.e., Western stuff. Uh, and even within Asia, and even still now, to many people, Asian equals traditional, and modern equals Western. And so we wanted to kind of break through those boundaries, and that's why it was important, especially for me, to say that we're not a museum of Asian visual culture, but a museum of visual culture in Asia, and it's that in Asia part that where things get sort of different and interesting.
I love that. I think that makes perfect sense too. It strikes me. I have a couple questions to kind of wrap up the conversation, but it strikes me that you have constantly been in these positions or in these institutions that combine different things, and so M plus was um, uh, architecture, design, art, visual culture. The New Institute is design and kind of digital media. Design Miami, when you were there, was really thinking about design broadly. How do you this is perhaps the hardest question of this conversation. How do you define design now, or do you have a sense of when you use that word, what that means?
Yeah, I mean, I mean, what I love about design is that if you ask, 20 people this question, you'll get 20 different answers. It's, once again,
Yeah,
all over
yeah,
the place, and that's what's
yeah,
wonderful
yeah.
to me about it. I mean, design for me is, it's really, it's kind of an it's kind of a it's kind of an ethos. It's an ethos
Hmm.
of possibilities. It's an ethos fundamentally of optimism, the things that the sense that things can always
Mm.
be better. But in a more detailed sense, maybe, it's really just how we articulate the world and our relationship to it and each other, and that
Mm.
articulation happens at all scales, both physically and virtually. Um, and I guess this really goes back to what you asked me earlier about my educational background, which was not, again, consciously. I wasn't conscious about it, but yeah, in the end, it's about people, things, and spaces. But as spaces and things have sort of expanded, as the notion of people is and the notion of the
Mhm.
human is expanding with AI and all the sort of more than human discourses that are out there at the moment. It all becomes it all becomes both clearer and blurrier at the same time. Uh,
Exactly.
and
Exactly.
in that sense, design is what helps us navigate this, right?
Mm.
Design used to be about problem solving. I remember, 20 years ago, it was all about problem solving, right?
Mhm.
And we don't talk about that as much anymore. And certainly on a micro level, design can solve problems for sure. But on a broader scale, the problems are too complex to be solved, and one person's problem is the other person is another's solution,
Right.
right? And so design
Right.
isn't about that, about solving any problems per se, but actually about how we mediate, moderate, navigate, and work our way through
Mm.
the complexities of our current and future conditions, and also our pasts. The New Institute is probably it's well known for its speculative work and work addressing contemporary issues. But as you mentioned, it has an amazing collection of architecture. It's the Dutch
Yeah.
National Collection of Architecture and Urban Planning. I've been told by my colleagues it's the world's largest architecture archive and collection.
Nice.
But
Nice.
as you know, and as everybody knows, we are now also realizing that the past, or we're now finally acknowledging how much more complex the past was
Yeah.
than it's
Yeah.
been presented, and so in that sense, there's a lot of new thinking to do around that as well.
I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about teaching. Teaching is kind of the core of my work these days, and you founded and have run the Curatorial Lab at Tongji University the last few years, which again is this kind of interesting program that is design history and criticism, but also a kind of research studio. How does that fit into your work, and kind of what are you kind of working on there right now?
So once again, I never thought of myself as a teacher, and I sort of just fell into it. But it's been really great, and I think on the one hand, the design history and criticism is in many ways a continuation of the work that we started at M Plus in revisiting these historical
Mm,
narratives, and the Curatorial Lab is, I guess. Yeah, I mean, I get there are elements of curation in there, but also elements of journalism in there, and also
mm,
elements of I guess my broader trajectory, which has always been kind of looking at specific contexts. I mean, we've been talking about about how I've been all over the place, and that's true. But in each place, you know, I've always tried to kind of find some sort of relevance to have what I'm doing there somehow rooted. And with the Curatorial Lab, I mean, to be in China at this moment. Um, and thinking about the role of curation in an expansive sense in addressing really the still evolving contemporary condition here has been super interesting. So, for example, we did a studio last year on art, shopping, and entertainment, a little bit using Rem
right.
Koolhaas's
Right.
famous Harvard Guide to Shopping,
Yeah.
20 years ago as a starting point.
Yeah.
But in China, so much of cultural production is being generated by brands and real estate developers, right? And
Mm-hmm.
and so we were looking
Mm-hmm.
at the phenomenon, especially of the art mall, which is becoming increasingly prevalent here
Right.
as a site of curatorial practice. Right now, we're looking at the notion of reverse curating. Now, many people may have heard that there's
Mm,
been this crazy museum building boom in China over the past 10 years. Um, Thousands of new museums have been built, but those have been driven largely by bureaucratic, political, and economic, and even
mm-hmm.
architectural agendas rather than curatorial ones. And so you have a lot of these oftentimes magnificent buildings, but no one knows what to really put inside them, and they're
Mm-hmm.
oftentimes misaligned with their context. So we're actually studying this phenomenon and developing strategies with our students to kind of reverse curate, right? To sort of start with the
Interesting.
building
That's so
and see
interesting.
what you can make out of it.
I mean, and I saw a little bit. I've heard you talk a little bit about the art and commerce project before, which is something that I spend a lot of time thinking about. Also, that we could easily have a whole conversation just about that. But I will end with the question that I use to end all of these. I'm curious what you're reading right now.
The one that I just picked up is called the question concerning technology in China, an essay in
Mm.
cosmotechnics uh, by
Oh,
Ye
interesting.
Kui. And he's a philosopher kind of known for his work on notions of techno Orientalism, and this is something that I got when I was working on a proposal for an exhibition that I was going to call Sino Future. Um,
Mm.
but I mean, it's probably not going to happen, at least no time soon. But this notion of multipolarity and
Mm.
also competing visions of the future as as the world kind of changes geopolitically. And I actually have a show up right now in Lisbon at the Museum of Art, Architecture and Technology about or looking at this kind of post-global condition that we seem to be entering. But the question of how the future is being positioned here in China is one that I think is important to to
Yeah.
look at, both in terms of the challenges it presents and perhaps the dystopian scenarios that it presents if we're not careful, but also in the sense of kind of clearing up misunderstandings from outside China, right? That
Right.
like I think this question needs to be sort of looked at in a clear-headed way, because there's too
Mm.
much at stake.
Yeah, that's so interesting. Aric, this was such a fascinating conversation for me. Like I said, I'm a fan of your work. I'm excited to see what you do at the new institute. Congratulations on the new job, and thanks for being on the podcast. I really enjoyed
Yeah,
this.
no, thank you. I really enjoyed it also, and really appreciate the chance to speak with you.
This episode was recorded on June 14th, 2021. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can support the show on Patreon and find previous episodes wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.